As I approached the lake, the shore was unfamiliar. I was used to rocky shores, ones where I had to walk carefully and take steps slowly. This one was one where the ground was like clay. My feet stuck in each step as I approached closer to the water. I started to sink a little into the ground, but as I came closer, I felt calm. I missed home, and I started to break a little, but I knew this was not home. At least, it wasn't for me, and this water had taken away. I wondered what it meant for me to be here, and to feel longing for home. I wondered what other people felt like coming to this water. Those who had lived in Washunga before. Ones who had never been to Washunga. Perhaps me being here is a story that needs to be told, but it might not be the right story to tell. But I've included it because it's how I have started to make sense of this event.
Like, I don't know what answers there are to be. And how do we keep, like, remembering? Like, both, like remembering, but also, like, remembering what happened.
In my research, I learned a lot of stories, but I also wonder, what stories do we tell? What stories can we tell through the archive? I'm left with a lot of questions to answer. And so this is where I begin. But first, let me tell you who I am. I am Elizabeth Elliott, daughter of Margaret Elliott, and my sister is Carmelita Elliott. I am named from my grandmother, Lucille Elizabeth Brown. These are the important women in my life. I'm from Kent, Washington, which is the traditional lands of the Duwamish, Muckleshoot, and Puyallup. I currently live in Manhattan, Kansas, and go to K-State, which was the first land-grant institution established under the 1862 Morrill Act, and the state of Kansas is historically home to many Native nations, including the Kaw, Osage, and Pawnee, and others. Currently, Kansas is home to 4 federally recognized Native nations: the Prairie Band Potawatomi, the Kickawa Tribe of Kansas, the Iowa Tribe of Kansas and Nebraska, and Sac and Fox Nation of Missouri and Kansas and Nebraska. Yeah, now I live in Kansas, but I still call home Kent, Washington. But home is also in my heart. It's where I am. And as I come to this work, I am not anywhere located geographically near Oklahoma or Kansas until now. And so part of this research is understanding my location, but also being comfortable with where I am. I think that as I tell the story and the story unfolds for this video, we begin to see the ways that we are still present to these institutions and systems within the context of settler colonialism and ongoing settler colonialism. And to me, the story is connected more than just to the past, but to the present and the future. I researched the flooding of Washunga for the creation of Kaw Lake and Kaw Dam in the 1960s. Kaw Lake wasn't completed until 1976, but the relocation of communities within the area that would become Kaw Lake occurred in the 1960s. Through it, I learned that there was also the flooding of Ancas and the partial flooding of Kaw City. Kaw City is the only town left intact, but it had to be relocated 2 miles from where it initially stood for most of its spaces. Like, that was sort of the 2 secondary sources that were like compiled histories of this event.
Okay.
Was really focused on the current impacts to Kaw City.
Oh, okay.
And then it had sort of footnotes about Washunga and Ancas.
Mm-hmm.
It wasn't really the main focus, but the one that was newer definitely talked more about like the current impact. Whereas the older one was just talking about, okay, what happened? Why does this town visibly look different?
Mm.
And talked a little bit more about the historical context and decline of Kaw City, where the newer one was talking more about like what was happening in the moment in the 1960s and the political differences that led to that, like both that decline, but also the ability to make the city relocate.
Yeah.
And I think like this research was also hard because like I was looking for the flooding of Washunga while also trying to piece these sources together that weren't talking about Washunga. They were talking about it very indirectly. But because of their relationality, like they are together.
Yeah.
Like they're different communities, but they're communities that still face the same challenges with the creation of Kaw Lake that then like led to where we are today, which also is related to this history of political power that Ponca City has. And like the sources I was looking at specifically were looking at like the impact of Kaw City as it's like the lasting and like remaining town, even though Kaw City was moved 2 miles from its initial spot in a lot of places. And like Kaw City is talked about in decline, sort of the continued natural flooding, but not really Washunga or Ancas was really talked about as like the primary impact, except for the Kaw Nation website, which is also really interesting as we're thinking about these community members were very like connected, and the people from Washunga, some moved to Kaw City, some moved to Newkirk, and like this displacement, but also like there wasn't just one place they could go. And especially for people from Kaw City, like a lot of them who had to move from one place to another didn't even stay in Kaw City. They ended up moving to Ponca City or like other bigger towns because they had more resources, and especially for elderly populations, it didn't make sense to stay in like Kaw City anymore.
Yeah.
Since they were already moving. But then like I haven't really seen a source that's directly talking about what the loss of Washunga did or the loss of Ancas did.
This little community of Uncas is condemned to die. When the Army Corps of Engineers decided to build still another dam on the Arkansas River, the government condemned this area. The people were paid government-established prices for their land and ordered out.
Like, I haven't found sources that are directly talking about those. They've sort of indirectly addressed this happened, but not what happened after. And I think that maybe because Kaw City is still standing, it's a little bit easier to describe that history.
Yeah.
Than the other 2 towns, or like possibly 3 towns. The flooding of Washunga was related to a much larger flood control plan by Oklahoma, started by Senator Robert S. Kerr. However, initially Kaw Lake was not a part of the flood control plan. It was actually with conversations from an engineer from Ponca City, which led to the possible Kaw Lake being added to the plan. Oklahoma has the largest number of lakes, but the majority of lakes are man-made in Oklahoma. And so, from that background knowledge, we were starting to contextualize the creation of Kaw Lake, as well as forming the question of what do lakes mean for Oklahoma, as we're getting more specific with what does Kaw Lake mean for Oklahoma. And that really was one of the first questions we had. Part of my introduction to the flooding of Washunga was through more recent events in which there was the finding of burial remains from the Washunga cemetery that were supposed to have been initially moved. Looking back at my research, the story I wanted to tell for this project was, how did the burial remains get left there? Who's responsible? How do we still understand that responsibility today and that impact today? I didn't find that answer. I found parts of how it's still impacting the Kaw Nation and community, and each source I found said a little bit different too.
Yeah.
And I also was using like not just like historical sources, but I was also looking at like a couple newspaper articles, a couple like of the original documents.
Oh yeah.
Of like relocating items, especially like specifically the cemetery items for Washunga, to understand sort of that first question of like the finding of remains and like why did this happen? And then from Kaw Nation, I really was trying to understand like how Washunga fit into their story or how they talked about Washunga. And I really found that like perhaps it's like the places I was looking for. Like I looked on a timeline. They talked about the flooding of Washunga, but not necessarily the remains being found.
Yeah.
But they talk about like the Native American Grave Protection and Repatriation Act. This was an act that enabled the indigenous tribes and communities in the U.S. to claim human remains for reburial. I thought it was interesting that they talked about NAGPRA, but they don't make the connection between Washunga.
Oh, okay, yeah.
But there's only one place on their website where they talk about the remains being found in the relationship to both Washunga and the Washunga Cemetery and the NAGPRA, which I like was thinking was going to be on that timeline, but it wasn't. It was on the historical events site. And then it's my understanding that in the 1996-ish, that's when the remains were found. And then by 2000, they were reburied. But in those entries, we're not seeing anything about that.
So they note that the town of Washunga was going to become the lake, but they don't note that. And they note that the cemetery is getting moved on this timeline, but they don't note that
the remains
were
found later on, and they weren't actually moved or weren't fully moved. Yeah. But they are identifying these key moments, which I think is really interesting. And I'm not sure if it's like, because this timeline is more attributed to one person. I'm not sure if they were the one person working on it or if they did have multiple conversations. I think there is a relationship there, but you have to see it between the lines. And so initially when I was seeing this, I was like, I was expecting to see that because I had read the newspaper articles talking about the finding of these remains, but then not seeing it here. And I really struggled to even find anything on the Kaw Nation that wasn't just talking about, without just talking about as like a Washunga Days event. I had to try to figure out how to reverse see it.
Yeah, because they mentioned the Washunga Tribal Cemetery in Newkirk.
Well, not necessarily the history behind it.
Yeah.
Actually, looking back, that, like, at first I was really confused on, like, where did the remains that were found get moved to? But until sort of, like, later on, I realized that it was Newkirk. And I think now this makes a lot more sense. But it still isn't, like, directly identifying that history.
Yeah.
But this is still an act of what's happening today. Yeah, I think it's interesting how they talk about remembrance, care,
and cultural preservation.
I think it's just like, especially for me coming into this project, I wanted to know the answers, but like, it's not a completed puzzle. It's like all these pieces that had to be put together to see the picture.
Yeah.
And so like, when I read this at first, I couldn't understand it. And I can see it now, even though I didn't, and I still don't have all the pieces. But like, I'm starting to see how like, what I've researched makes sense. And like, is this care for today? Then just like one quick thing.
Yeah, please.
Is I think it's really interesting the sources that I found that are talking about the recreation of Kaw Lake and like the benefits of Kaw Lake as a recreational space.
Yeah.
Like they don't really talk about the indigenous community using it. They have geographic markers, but they've done it by state and by age. They haven't done it necessarily by race, like gender, ethnicity, which I think also says a lot about that research being done and like the absence of focusing on who's in that community. Even though they are like identifying like regionally what state and like how far people are coming from.
Yeah.
They're not talking about who are these actual people. I pieced a lot of stories together through my research. I think the story I first wanted to tell was, how are people feeling about the finding of remains of their families? Ultimately, that's not the story I found. That's not the story that got told to me through the archives. It was much bigger, and it was about the loss of a community. Actually, multiple communities. And learning about that story told me about here. It told me about where I am located in Kansas, the fact that the Kaw, Osage, and other nations are originally from Kansas, but were moved to Oklahoma, and then once they were moved out of Kansas, how they were still getting moved into the 1960s. There are still consequences today and impacts today, and I don't know all of those answers. But for me, I am still trying to locate myself here, and this helped me start to see ways I can connect and remember parts of myself. I'm left with a lot of questions, but I also wonder what stories I left out. And so there's so many voices that I know I didn't capture, and a lot of stories that I couldn't have captured.